idea that David wanted to show the power of God. However, David was at least a little bit interested in money and power and not paying taxes, like the rest of us, right? What's funny is, if we skip 3 verses later, in the span of 3 verses, David's older brother finds him and kind of chews him out. What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. And as soon as that chewing out ends, this is what we see in verse 30. So David turned to someone else and asked the same thing. And the people said the same thing in reply. He's walking around the camp being, what will y'all give me if I take care? What am I going to get paid if I kill this guy? What's in it for me? David doesn't seem so selfless anymore. He doesn't seem like this guy who's standing only on the promise and the trust in God. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying he's considering his stock options, right? Like, what am I going to get if I come out mano a mano with this guy? What's in it for me? I think this is a good thing for us to read as adults. Because if we only remember David as this selfless guy who considers no risk to himself, I'll die in the service of proving that God is on my side. If we only remember him as this unimpeachable story of faith, then it's kind of hard to read that for our own lives. So I think a lot of times, although we may have the best of intentions and we have the desire to grow as followers of Jesus, I think there are very few of us who are willing to stake our lives on how good our faith is. There are not a lot of us who will step out into pure risk only with the motivation of proving that God is on our side. I think that we can see that David is a complicated guy with multiple motivations at the same time. He both wants to stick up and defend for Israel, but he also wants a payday. I think in some ways when we see this David getting ready to step forth before Goliath, we can see that David's just as complicated as me and you. And that ultimately God has not raised up this perfect example of a person, and the lesson that we can take from it is, well, you just go be perfect just like he was. David's a guy with ambition. He wants to rise. He has competing and complicating motives. He has an eye towards rising to the top, of getting rich and making a name for himself. And if you follow his story all the way through, you'll see that this ambition and these motives that are on display here before he fights Goliath, they're going to get him in trouble down the road. Let's get a little more honest about this story. When we read the whole span of David in the book of 1 Samuel, we're reading these stories, story after story, that is trying to prove that God is raising David up, that nothing can stop him. He will be king of Israel. So in some ways, these stories, when we read them, as tempting as it is to want to read the story with ourselves in the place of the main character or the protagonist, what does David have to teach about my life? This story is not about us. This is a story of how God raised up an exceptional leader to lead God's